Hello and welcome once again to Dave and Marlow of Blazers Edge podcast. I'm Dave Deckard here with Marlow Ferguson. Marlow, how are you doing today?
It's not Marlow, Dave.
What? No, that's definitely not Marlow's voice. Oh, say something. Oh, what a gorgeous voice. Just say more. Just tell me what you had for breakfast. I don't care.
Definitely not Marlow. It's Adrian Bernecich, also from Blazers Edge, and I'm talking to you from sunny Melbourne. We're getting ready for a nice hot Christmas.
So if I understand things correctly, you are from Australia?
That is correct.
And you hit Marlow upside the head with a didgeridoo and took his spot in the podcast here for a week.
I can neither confirm nor deny.
Oh, well, actually, Marlow had connection problems due to the blizzard we are currently having. He is in the Midwest, but we are proving that Blazers Edge stretches not just across the country, but across the globe, underneath, looking up at a different set of stars, experiencing 80-degree Decembers, is Adrian, and also an astute Blazers observer. Glad to have you with us. Now, I must tell you that we might have been justified in giving Marlow the boot because and by the way, he's been correct most of the season, but when we talked last Thursday, he said the Blazers would go 4-0 in their next 4 games. They lost to Dallas, they beat the Rockets, but then lost twice to Oklahoma City, going 1-3. Instead of Christmas celebration, we have sad trombones. Adrian, what have you noticed about the last week? I mean, has anything struck you as particularly indicative about the way the Blazers are playing and why they've only won 1 game?
Well, the losing is never fun, especially games where you can argue that they're probably the favourite, even though they're in the middle of a 6-game road trip. I can only imagine they can't wait to get home. I did see last night they had some trouble getting into Denver with some blizzards and whatnot. But look, I think this team is where it was supposed to be at the start of the season. I think our colleague Dan Morang said as long as they're over 500 by Christmas, then that's fine. And they're 100% going to be over 500 for Christmas, even if they lose tomorrow. Obviously, it's not as great as what it was throughout the first part of the season, but I think this team has reverted to the mean, and I think putting the hardest part of the schedule behind them can only mean, hopefully, fingers crossed, with the return of Gary Payton too next week, as we learned earlier today, hopefully things are on the way up.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things that I've noticed. I mean, Dame had a hard game, that last one in Oklahoma City, and really in crunch time struggled just a little bit, although he got burned unfairly in the first Oklahoma City game, the one that was close, right down to the end, and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander sunk the baseline jumper. Dame actually beat Dort a couple times off the drive and looked brilliant doing it, but he had a third drive where Oklahoma City collapsed on him and he got stuffed and kind of turned the ball over. And then, of course, Gilgeous-Alexander didn't. He was being guarded by Justice Winslow on that final shot. And, you know, Justice is a good defender, but not necessarily the guy you want defending the opposing point guard when the point guard is really hot. It pointed out a couple different things. One, you don't want to be in close games against anybody, and the Blazers almost always are. And number 2, you still don't have solid lockdown backcourt defenders. That may speak to your point about Gary Payton II and the need for him, because you have to believe if he was in that game, he would have been defending Gilgeous-Alexander rather than Winslow.
He probably would have been guarding Luka Doncic a week ago as well. It would have been either him or Grant. But I mean, I don't want to say that Gary Payton is going to come back and save this team and lead them towards a title, because that's just unrealistic. But over the past week, there have been lapses. There have been defensive lapses, especially off the bench. And Gary is clearly going to come off the bench initially. He's going to provide that defensive improvement to help guys like Shaedon Sharpe and Trendon Watford kind of strengthen that wall on the defensive side of the ball. But look, yeah, I think it's important that Gary comes in and actually plays, because obviously a lot of people have been negative or not as optimistic about the chances of him returning. Obviously, today we heard that he is going to come back, or hopefully going to come back next week. But the team looks like it's gassed a little bit. It ran really hard the first part of the season. The tempo of the game was really, really fast. Obviously, some guys are carrying some injuries. We saw Winslow obviously limp off the court yesterday. But from what we understand, he's been carrying a few things. Jeremy Grant's been carrying a few things. Yusuf Nurkic has been carrying a few things. I think there are only a couple of games next week. I think this team really needs a rest, especially given the fact that they've played almost half their road games for the season, and it's not even January yet.
Yeah, well, let's stay on that bench because it's not just defensive problems that they're having. The first game versus Oklahoma City, Portland's bench scored 26 points out of the 121 that the Blazers scored. They shot 10 for 25 from the field, which is that's not enough help there. The Dallas game that was a loss, the bench played half the game, so their aggregate production was good. But that second Oklahoma City game, we have 9, 17, 28 points out of 98, which is a better percentage, but that's only because the starters went bonk. I mean, the bench didn't actually produce more, and they played more minutes. So, I mean, this bench is starting to show its weaknesses. At the beginning of the season, when everybody was fresh, it was scrappy. The Blazers were getting some breakaway points. It looked good. Now, all of a sudden, the bench is not producing offensively, which puts an enormous strain on the starters. And as you say, they're starting to struggle defensively. The starters are getting tired. The bench just isn't enough to support them, or at least not enough for Chauncey Billups to rely on. And that's starting to be exposed as the season rolls along.
When was the last time the Blazers had depth, though? I mean, I'm racking my brains over the past decade to find a decent enough depth on this team. Damian Lillard is used to carrying the offensive load here. We all thought that this was the season the depth was going to improve. And look, it probably has marginally, but as Joe Cronin always says, this team is not complete and further moves will have to be made over the next 2 months. You can't rely on Trendon Watford to be scoring points. You can't rely on 19-year-old Shaden Sharp to be scoring points. While Drew Eubanks possesses eons of hustle and energy, you can't expect Drew Eubanks to be carrying that offensive load. More work needs to be done in reinforcing this bench unit because we know the starters can score. There's no doubt about that. I feel like I've gone back 8 years and we're talking about Damian, Wes Matthews, Nicola Batum, LaMarcus Aldridge, and Robin Lopez with a so-so bench. This is not a new problem for the Portland Trail Blazers, but which highlights the work that still needs to be done to improve this roster.
Yeah, it's really interesting because the holes, and we knew they were there, it's just hard to see at the beginning of the season because everything gets thrown on the table, right? It's like all the puzzle pieces are out there unassembled. It's like, well, I have 1,000 pieces, looks like a puzzle, I just got to put it together. But as you start putting it together, you realize the holes in the picture and the pieces you don't have. And it's becoming more apparent that the Blazers have a fantastic top three, right? I mean, nearly unrivaled in the league as far as collective scoring power. I mean, of course, you look at the Lakers and they have a good top three. You look at the Clippers and they have a top 2.5. Okay, so they're, Milwaukee, I get it. But look, Damian Lillard, Anthony Simons, and Jeremy Grant, you go, hey, 3 20-point scorers and Lillard is darn near 30, you're good to go, right? You also have a lot of exciting players who would make, let's say, 10 through 15. I mean, if you just had to fill 5 slots from the players south of Grant, you would go, yeah, we can do that. But where it's getting mushy is right in the middle, right in that 4 through 8 area. So Nurkic kind of inconsistent. Although I think he's played better now as the season's rolled along. He was really inconsistent at the beginning, but
I think he's in shape now. I think he's actually played himself into a little bit of shape, which is crucial for a guy his size.
Right. Josh Hart, can't ask anything more of. He's doing fantastic, but is he the right guy? I mean, he has potential that's untapped. He's also a little small for his position. He's really become a good rebounder, but he can get overmatched defensively at the small forward position. And again, he's probably the ideal solution at shooting guard for a lot of teams. Maybe not so much at small forward for the Blazers, even though, as Marlow and I have discussed, we like him more than we like almost any other Trailblazer on this roster. I mean, he's great, but, you know, off and on with certain things. And then when you get to the high bench, it gets really mushy. I mean, Shaedon Sharpe, okay. Justin Winslow, it's done great. But can you run those guys night in and night out? And as you say, look, you're probably looking at Drew Eubanks next. Keon Johnson after him. Boy, that's, you know, okay. We just had a drop-off. We need kind of those middle players, perhaps, to provide more consistency at the lower starter and the higher bench positions. Blazers just don't have that.
You could also argue that the Thunder are nothing but, I mean, aside from Shea, are nothing but middle of the range players. They actually, they don't have any top line players outside of Shea, but they have so many players that meet that 4 to 10 bracket. Obviously, a lot of rookies and sophomore players there, but a lot of them have that ability to compete at that 4 to 10 level, which is probably why they gave Portland such nightmares. And obviously, Portland weren't blown out at all. They were in both games right to the end, and for whatever reason, they weren't able to kind of deliver in the clutch, which is unlike this team, especially a Damian Lillard team. But people are upset, and rightly so, that they lost to the Thunder on 2 occasions. It's hard to do that. But the Thunder aren't a bad team. They're not a good team, but they're not a bad team. And I think a lot of teams are starting to realise this after playing the Oklahoma City franchise this season.
Yeah. And here's the thing. This brings up 2 points, one statement and one question for you. The statement is people forget that the Blazers are like the 4th or 5th youngest team in the league still. So some of these players, especially the bench players, are still developing, right? So you're not going to get that consistent production. But it also brings up the question, okay, how do you go forward from here? Do you think the top 3 and the bottom is good enough to where if you fill the middle, you can make a run for a title? So you try to win now. Or do you lean into, well, you know, they are young and developing. And you might trade away some of those middle assets that are more veteran in order to, build for the future. I'm not sure what the right answer to that is.
Neither do I. And obviously it also depends on which players you are bringing in to replace that or to reinforce that 4 to 10 range. Before the start of the season, the Blazers were clearly in 2 timelines, and that hasn't changed. You've got your 25 plus and your Lillards and Grants and Nurkic's, and you've got your Shaedon Sharps. And I guess the Blazers want to have their pie and eat it too. And I don't think they've made a clear decision. And I don't think this year is particularly important to the Blazers. While they want to win as many games as they can, they're still kind of they're not trading Shaedon Sharpe, which means if you're not trading Shaedon Sharpe, you still have an eye on the future. And as we get closer to the February 9 deadline, we'll wait to see whether Cronin is prepared to trade that remove the protections on that Chicago pick, as doing that means you really have to win as many games as you can. But in doing so, you're able to trade those future assets and bring in those players that could potentially help you win in 22-23 and going forward. But as long as Shaedon Sharpe is on this roster, there has to be a long-term view or a long-term element to the way you build this team.
Well, and there are really 2 assets. I mean, besides Sharpe, if they wanted to move Sharpe for help, that would probably be the quickest way, but I don't see any way they do that, right? So there are 2 possibilities. One you've mentioned, removing the protection on the Chicago pick. But if you do that so that you can trade future draft picks for help, you better get that right. Because the nightmare is the Blazers are 3 losses away from 3rd in the West and 3 losses away from like 13 in the West. and 13 is not a playoff. And where they sit, by the way, is in the play-in, right? So if you don't make the playoffs and you have a lottery pick and you have a generational center on the line and you just removed your protection on your pick in order to win this season and don't, that's a comedy of errors that is huge. Now, can they get, Wemby? I don't think so. But you don't even want to be in that position. You know what I mean? You don't want to, you've got to gulp twice before you casually remove those Chicago pick, or the protection on the Chicago pick. Here's the other thing. Josh Hart. He's the one who's out there because of his contract. He can opt out. And I've maintained since the Blazers got him that I'd be pretty darn surprised if he keeps his current contract into next season. It's only $13 million. Okay. Anthony Simons is making twice that. Okay. Yusuf Nurkic is making more than that. Josh Hart's got to think that he can get a raise. And he's proving he can do that. I don't think he stays without extra money. I don't think the Blazers can pay him because they can't luxury tax for a team that's not a really high contender. So if they have to trade Hart, that's going to show what they're doing. Do they trade him to get young and get assets, or do they trade him to get more help?
I mean, I think regardless of Hart's situation, they're going to end up in the luxury tax next season because they are going to, 99% sure they are going to extend Grant, and you've got Lillard and you've got Simons and you've got Nurkic, and then, Nas Little's getting a little bit of a rise. But I think in order to make this team better, you've got 2 or 3 real key factors. That Josh Hart contract, because Josh Hart, while he is limited on the Blazers in playing the starting 3, he is a player that every other team wants. He plays hard. He can do a little bit of everything. He's not shooting as much from long range this year, but he does so much he could adapt to any situation. You've got those picks. If you do remove the protections, you've got those picks, and you've got your Justice Winslow, Nazir Little, Keon Johnson type players. They're your tools leading into the February 9 deadline that you can use to improve this roster. Because the way this payroll is set up, the Blazers are going back to the luxury tax, whether they like it or not. I think it's a foregone conclusion. They could probably duck it this year. They're currently a few thousand below it, but I think I would be reluctant to go into the luxury tax with the current team. You need to make improvements to the current team, and the only way to do that is to trade assets like Josh Hart and draft picks to bring in better players and fill in that 4 to 10 range.
Yeah, well, the question would be, yes, they're going to be luxury taxed, but how far? If they plan to retain Hart, in other words, he opts out and they pay him $20 million. Okay. Now, you're talking serious change because for those who don't know, and I think most listeners probably do, but the luxury tax is graded. In other words, if you're between 0 and 5 million over, it's 1 penalty, and 5 and 10 or whatever it is, 10 and 20, and over 20 million over, it gets really exorbitant. It ends up being at the top end like 5 times the contract that you pay. And the problem is not just Hart's contract. The problem is pushing into that upper zone to where now you want to go get a $2 million player, and that player in effect costs you $10 million. That you can't operate financially that way, especially if you're Portland. And it really does end up limiting the future moves that you can make. Now, you can go that high. Brooklyn has, the Warriors have, but Brooklyn did it for Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving and fully expected to contend. Golden State Warriors are winning championships. So that's when you go that high. For them to keep Hart, there's a huge burden of proof there. I just don't think it's going to happen. But the question is, of course, now Hart is one of those 4 to 8 players, right? 4th position in the rotation down to 8th. So you're losing the best guy you have in that weakest section that you're trying to help. Who are you going to bring in who's better? I suppose the answer might be a real small forward or a small forward with a more defined skill set. One wonders if Nurkic is untouchable in this scenario too. Go ahead.
Well, I think what we've learned from what the Blazers have done over the past 10 months is ability is great, but fit is probably more important. While trading away CJ and Norman and Roko might have been kind of seen as, for what they brought back, might have been seen as losing or downgrading, they actually brought in players that made sense. So I'm not saying Josh Hart doesn't make sense on this current Blazers team, but you're right. Trading Josh Hart might get you that 6'7", 6'8" small forward that you've been chasing. It might get you Nurkic's backup, someone who can play 7 foot like a Mo Bamba, who can stretch the floor and also play a bit of defense. You're right. Lillard, Simons, and Grant should be the core. And obviously, people are a bit frustrated with Simons at the moment. The guy's 23, and he's still learning. We need to. I know it's a terrible word, but the word patience needs to be kind of exercised here. But I think, as I said before, while ability is important, I think fit is crucial for this team, because at the end of the day, this team plays around Damian Lillard, Anthony Simons, and Jeremy Grant, and we need the right pieces around them. It's what the San Antonio Spurs did for so long. It's what the Warriors have done for so long. You need players that make sense around your star players.
Now, I'm a sincere little believer. I think he could fill in at small forward if he's healthy. I wouldn't discount that the Blazers, if they're running Hart there, they could probably run Sharp there for at least limited duty. Those are two exciting young guys who could be a 1-2 punch at the 3 position. Gary Payton II has played some small forward as well in real small lineups. Look, they're cobbling together things with Hart anyway. I love Hart, but cobbled together with Hart or cobbled together with those other 3 and then someone else significant bolstering the center position or whatever, that might actually in the long run bring more depth or more useful depth than they have right now.
I've no doubt that Sharp can play the small forward. He can't play it right now. From what I've seen, he's as skinny as anything. He's 6'5" or 6'6". He could still be growing. But he could, if he fulfills 70% of the prophecy that came with him at the draft.
Sorry to stop you, but it's like a fantasy novel. This is the prophesied one. This is the same. Yeah, no, I love it.
At the draft, all we had was mystery and hearsay and Schmitz's kind of review on what Shaden was. If Shaden can grow a little bit and be 70% of what people were saying he is a starting small forward in this league. But that's not helping this team right now. And look, Nazir Little, I love Naz. I feel so sorry for the guy. He can't get his body right, and it's the way he plays as well. He does throw his body around, which means he is more susceptible to picking up injuries like he has. I don't know whether the answer at small forward is currently on the roster. It could be Sharp. I don't know whether the answer at center is currently on the roster with the up and down play we've seen from Yusuf. But I don't envy Joe Cronin, but I'm confident in his ability to competently build this roster. I'm just trying to, when I get frustrated with a loss or 2 losses as we saw in Oklahoma City, I try and exercise that patience and knowing that this team is not a finished product. This team isn't the Boston Celtics or the Milwaukee Bucks, which essentially have their rosters that are going to compete for a championship in June. This team is still in production, and we just need to be cognizant of that.
Yeah, and it's so hard because expectations got sent through the roof with that start.
Yep.
And, I feel like I should have known better. I'm not about the expectations, but about a 10-4 start was unprecedented, unheard of, and full marks to them. But it's one of the lessons that you forget when things have been the same for the team all the damn time for most of a decade. And then it goes into utter chaos because you have that season we had last year. So we have we have either utter predictability or no tracking at all. But here's the lesson that we used to know. The first 20 games in the NBA are unpredictable. Literally anything can happen. And if you're going to play tough teams, it's usually pretty good to play them at the very beginning of the season because weird things happen. And it feels like the roulette wheel just spun black, 10 times for the Blazers in the first 14 games, which odds say shouldn't happen, but kind of did. And great. But unfortunately, you can't walk away with your winnings there. You have to keep putting them back on the table. And that wheel's still spinning, and they're coming back to average now. But the expectation of what you thought you had haunts them. The front office can't do that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wrote about that exact thing a couple of weeks ago. The fact that first 3 weeks really kind of, I was excited. I was talking with Steve DeWild, who's also on Blazers Edge, and we were both saying, wow, they don't even have Gary Payton yet, and they're winning all these games. What happens when Gary Payton comes back? This can win a title. I'm booking my flights to Portland, leaving my wife and infant child behind so I can watch them win a title in Portland. I clearly got ahead of myself. I didn't account for what reality has in store, and the reality tells us that an imperfect team, will always come back to the mean, and more work needs to be done. And I think a lot of fans are finding it difficult to kind of come to that conclusion.
Well, and the front office cannot fall prey to this, right? And to his credit, I think Joe Cronin didn't, even when they were. So look, in the past regime, when Neil Olshey was here, you would hear from Neil Olshey when they were hot, and he would go silent when they lost, right? Cronin was pretty silent through that first bit. And then afterwards, when he did speak, it's just like, yeah, well, good job. We got work to do, right? And it's like,
yep.
Yes, that's correct. And I wonder if it's in the front office's mind yet that this is a viable team. And I wouldn't be surprised if the answer is still kind of not. It's kind of, it's not quite there. It looks good. It's entertaining. Those boxes are checked. Damian Lillard, fantastic, check. Shaedon Sharpe, exciting, check. Still don't have the framework to take full advantage of all that.
I would be concerned if they did consider it a viable product. I would be. I don't want to talk about Neil Olshey a lot because we all know about Neil and what he did for a decade. But I'd like to think that this current front office is a little bit more in touch with reality and is self-aware. And in the times that Joe Cronin has spoken, I think he's a pretty smart guy, and he's pretty self-aware. And I think. He said it himself. This team isn't good enough. He said it on the Jack Ramsey's a couple months ago. This team is not good enough. We haven't put all our chips in yet. And obviously putting in all our chips means probably at some point, if they don't give up the Chicago pick next year, they're going to have to remove protections on it at some point, and they're going to have to move chips in for a player. I don't think he's stupid. I don't think he's going to do it. I don't think losing 2 games in Oklahoma City are going to make him kind of pick up the phone and make silly moves to improve the roster now. But I've no doubt that he thinks that his work is not finished, and there are a lot of hard yards and a lot of difficult phone calls that he has to make, not only over the next 2 months, but over the next 2 years to get this team to where it should be, because the goal at the end of the day should be a championship. And I think for a decade here, we were content with mediocrity. And I think fans got used to being content with mediocrity, and we allowed the good teams to win championships as long as we were making the playoffs, regardless of what happened in those playoffs. So I have much more confidence in the current incarnation of the Blazers front office.
Well, and if that is true, then I think we've answered some of our own questions. If you don't believe this team is ready to contend now, it makes no sense to keep Hart through the postseason just to watch him walk. And also, it makes no sense to pay a fortune to keep him and have essentially the same team. So, we're where we were at the beginning of the season. He's likely to be traded before February. You start asking questions about Nurkic. They just re-signed him, but doesn't mean he can't be a trade piece. I think in some ways you start asking questions about Simons too, a little bit. depending on what you think he can bring you on the market. And like you, I am high.
Shame on you. Shame on you, Dave. Shame on you.
Well, I'm high on him because his three-point shooting is an asset that is phenomenal. Yeah. And the way he can produce offense is phenomenal. And you know what? If Lillard weren't on this team, everyone would be going, this guy is the next guy. This guy is, as good as Gilgeous-Alexander or a lot of other people that you go, wow, wish we had him. He's overshadowed a bit by Lillard, still learning how to play with him. But assuming Lillard's going to stay, which we've been through 2 years of debating that, so we'll just assume he's with the team. You start asking, okay, what if a super premium piece costs you your starting shooting guard? It's not an impossible scenario.
Oh, absolutely not. And I think, yeah, it depends on the player. And I can't even think of the player right now. I mean, short of Giannis Antetokounmpo, I can't think of the player now. Look, and just touching on Nurkic, that contract they gave was exorbitant, but I think that contract will come in handy if they need to match salary with one of those big players down the track. Obviously, if that player isn't a center, then they've got another headache. But I think Nurkic's contract after January 15 helps this team match salary for a player that they really are interested in. But obviously, that remains to be seen.
Yeah, 100%. And what's nice about that contract is it is flexible. It doesn't cost you a fortune, but it is movable. That said, the most likely move is always no move, because trades are actually hard to make in the NBA. Mm-hmm. And particularly when you have some undefined stuff in Portland's repertoire. I mean, is there the player who's going to make the difference? Yeah, that player would be awfully hard to get. So they may still keep with some incremental moves. And, it's not guaranteed that they are going to make a move. But if they do, you're definitely looking at Hart, as you say, Justice Winslow, definite possibility. I think you go up to Nurkic as a C-level possibility, not real hot, but not completely cold. Simons is a remote possibility, but I think still in the ballpark. Anything lower than Winslow, and Winslow, by the way, is just because of his salary. I think actually anything lower than Hart only brings you marginal value and is probably just used to make salaries match.
Just finally on just on that point as well. Whenever I get a bit down on the way the Blazers are playing, I imagine this team with CJ, Norm, and Cove from last year, and I feel a whole lot better. It could be worse. That's how I justify it to myself as well.
Yeah, I mean, and that's an interesting point, like a macro point. The Blazers actually traded away a lot of veterans that had talent. In fact, you remember how they got roasted for that Clippers trade. But they ended up with, just as much talent, almost. And they have some veterans and a lot of young guys. They didn't move forward, I don't think, at least not yet. But they certainly didn't move backwards. And they have, I think, somewhat more flexibility and a little more attractive trade pieces, at least individually. So I think that I still think Cronin has done a good job. I just think it's a multi-step job, and there hasn't been time to take all the steps.
And just to that, I was listening to two, I think it was Kevin O'Connor and Bill Simmons on two separate podcasts this week, and they were both saying, I think, about Toronto and Chicago, why don't they go the Portland Trail Blazers route, where they suck for a year and they're able to kind of retool their roster. Joe Cronin may have very well created a way to have built a team in less than a year. If national pundits are referring to the Portland method, then there's got to be some merit to it. I mean, obviously, people from other parts of the country are picking up on what the Blazers have done and are appreciative of it.
If they wish to suck for a year, I have a small forward and a center that I could trade them for Pascal Siakam. And, that would probably cause them to suck for a year. And, they can make use of both of those. Okay, so they have Van Fleet, they have Gary Trent Jr., they have Josh Hart, they have Yusuf Nurkic, and they have Scotty Barnes, right? That's not a terrible lineup. and then you have a lottery pick. There you go. Okay, Toronto, we've got this.
Did you have OG in that picture as well?
Oh,
or is OG now in Portland?
No, they have him too. So they're gonna be all right with that. Okay, we've got our deal now. The Dave and Adrian show has now come up with the perfect solution for all parties involved. All the Blazers would need to do then would be to get a center somewhere. And
he's making the call to Masai Ujiri. It's not me. I don't want to deal with that guy. He's ruthless from all reports. I do not want to deal with Masai Ujiri.
Yeah, but, come on. Pascal Siakam's had enough years. He's won a championship there. They don't need him anymore. Come on. It's Josh Hart. Josh Hart does a lot of things. He's a Swiss Army knife.
Just will it into existence.
Exactly. And Yusuf Nurkic. Who doesn't like Nurk? I mean, Nurk fever. It warms up Canada. I mean, it's cold up there. It can be done. All right. Before we depart, the Blazers only play twice. I always ask Marlow for his predictions. He is almost always right. Last week, wait a minute here now. As we said, last week he was totally wrong, said 4-0, they're 1-3, and all of a sudden he has connection problems? So, we're going to make it easy on you, Adrian. They play tomorrow at Denver. By the time people hear this, that game will have been completed. And then they play Monday, the day after Christmas, versus Charlotte at home. Charlotte has won like 2 games all season. So what's your prediction there? I mean, for both those games.
So I don't think they win in Denver, but I'm happy if they prove me wrong. I wouldn't be writing off the Charlotte Hornets, who just got LaMelo Ball back. And look, Gordon Hayward is, I'm not sure, it might be one of those nights where he's not playing. They're not as bad as what they were, but I would expect the Blazers to win against Charlotte. Are we talking in the Golden State game, or is that too far away?
That is Friday. Marlow will be back before then, so we can't.
Okay, I won't touch on that one.
Yeah. So 1-1. Okay, I have to say something different, so I will say that they surprised Denver after this crappy road trip. Now, this is old Blazers more than new Blazers, but remember Damian Lillard's Blazers, every time they stink and you write them off, they bounce back with an impossible feat and it sends them on a run. Every time they're soaring high and you think they can't lose, they lose 6 out of 8. So we've seen the latter part already this year. So I will say 2-0 just to be different, and then we will see what happens. If you are right, I will owe you an Australian beer, which comes in like rain barrels, right? As I understand it.
In what?
Rain barrels, like huge, like you have to drink like beers with like 2 hands.
No, right? No. We have our bottles and our cans just like you guys do over there.
Really?
It's all the same.
You have advanced that far, huh? Wow.
Yeah, I know. We're getting there. We're getting closer.
Oh, well, I mean, we have pretty good opera houses over here. Have you heard of those?
Yeah, but that's Sydney. Melburnians don't want to talk about Sydney. There's a rivalry going on there. So we have like food and sport and culture down here. So that's what we're famous for.
Oh, okay. So what kind of sport is popular in Melbourne? Who should we root for?
Well, Melbourne is the home of sport in Australia. I'll just say that. So we have Australian rules. Many of you probably aren't aware of it. Some of you do. It's really hard to explain. The best thing to do is Google it. But it's an oval-shaped ground, and a lot of 36 guys running around, hitting each other without pads. So that's probably the best way to describe it. We've got cricket, we've got basketball, although it's nowhere near as good as the NBA. We've got in the northern states, we have rugby league and rugby union. We have soccer. We have cricket in the summer. So we're not short on sport.
That's good. And you have like killer jellyfish that basically eat you, right?
Up north, yeah. Okay. You don't go swimming up north in summer.
Okay. Well, yeah. This is what I know about Australia. I only know stereotypes, so we'll have to have you back.
I mean, a lot of people think we have kangaroos in the backyard and snakes and spiders killing us left, right, and centre. It doesn't really happen in built-up areas. So you're very safe coming to the major cities. You're gonna avoid all those nasty predators. So,
okay. Those spiders are the reason that I will never go to Australia, because I have seen the pictures, and those things are. Yeah, unimaginable. Like, I would see one and burn the whole country.
You'd have to go a long way to find one of those spiders outside a city. So that's my advice to you.
Okay, well, that's good. I will stay in the cities then and carry enormous cans of Raid or bug spray. Although they'd probably just beat me up and take my can. They carry like switchblades.
Well,
right?
I mean, I wouldn't I wouldn't write that off. Unlikely, but you can never say never.
Okay. Well, sorry to stereotype your entire country based on my inadequate knowledge. Thanks for joining us last minute. We absolutely appreciate it, Adrian. And hey, look, during the course of this podcast, Adrian has name dropped like a ton of Steve DePaul and Dan Meringue and stuff. And every time it's like, oh yeah, that guy's pretty good. And it's like, oh yeah, that guy's with Blazers Edge. So we are glad we have you too. Check out Adrian's Angles every Saturday and other stories in between. And we will see you all again next week.